As World War II was winding down, President Franklin Roosevelt met with Saudi Arabian King Saud. These conversations, along with Franklin's gift of his personal wheelchair to the king, laid the foundation for U.S. Saudi relations for generations to come. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. In 1921, at the age of 39, Franklin Roosevelt was diagnosed with polio, which left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. In addition to using crutches and braces, Roosevelt also used wheelchairs to get around, but they did not give him the mobility and independence he wanted. The first images of wheeled furniture used to move people were depicted in Chinese and Greek art around the 5th century BCE. It would be another 1,000 years before wheeled chairs made specifically to move people were found in Chinese art. And another 1,000 years after that, in 1595, an unknown inventor made a wheeled chair for King Philip II of Spain, who suffered from severe gout during the last 2 years of his life. This throne on wheels was known as an invalid chair and didn't have a mechanism for self-propulsion, which was fine because Philip was a king and had plenty of people to push his chair around for him. In 1655, 22-year-old paraplegic watchmaker Stefan Farfler made a mobile chair for himself using a 3-wheeled chassis and a system of cranks and cogwheels. Considered the first propelled wheeled chair, it was more like a hand-cranked bike. Fast forward to the 1920s. In Roosevelt's earliest days dealing with his paralysis, FDR probably used the invalid chair that belonged to his father. It shared many common characteristics with commercially produced wheelchairs during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. High backs, wide seats, armrests, and adaptable footrests provided a level of comfort and support. However, there were drawbacks. Most buildings at the time were not wheelchair accessible, including Roosevelt's own home. The flights of stairs, doorways, and corridors were too tight and narrow. Because of the chair's width and armrests, it was difficult for Roosevelt to maneuver himself in and out of the chair without assistance. Due to their size, they were hard for him to maneuver, and they were extremely noticeable, which was not a trait Roosevelt wanted while he was running for political office. In order to address these shortcomings, Roosevelt designed his own wheelchairs and had them fabricated by a local blacksmith at Hyde Park, New York. These chairs were very different. According to Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, I think the most original innovation was Franklin's own invention. He converted several kitchen chairs into wheelchairs. Being armless and light of weight, they were extremely easy for my husband to manipulate. He started with something people were used to seeing in their own homes, a popular, basic oak dining room chair. He chopped off the legs and replaced them with bicycle-like wheels. This lighter and narrower design allowed him to easily navigate the hallways of his home and even the aisles of the presidential train car. And without arms and with wheels below the level of the seat, Roosevelt was more easily able to independently transfer his body to and from the chair. Over the years, FDR made adjustments to his chairs, including adding a removable seat cushion and even an ashtray. Even with these improvements, Roosevelt didn't like to spend a lot of time in his wheelchair. According to his grandson, Curtis Roosevelt, my grandfather used his wheelchair as little as possible. It was painful for him to ride on bare wood, and the muscles in his buttocks and thighs were not strong enough to hold him in the wheelchair unless he firmly grasped the sides of it with one hand. Upon entering a room, FDR would quickly transfer into a desk chair or comfortable sofa. When a newspaper editor insisted that polio left him wheelchair-bound, FDR replied, "As a matter of fact, I don't use a wheelchair at all, except a little kitchen chair on wheels to get about my room while dressing, and solely for the purpose of saving time." There are currently no known records indicating when FDR first ordered the construction of his own custom wheelchairs, how many of these wheelchairs were made, or who made them. What we do know is that as president, these wheelchairs helped him travel the globe. In February 1945, as World War II was winding down and Allied victory seemed inevitable, Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin in Yalta within the Soviet Union to discuss the post-war world order. On his return trip, FDR had a secret meeting with the first king of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz bin Abdul Rahman Al Saud, internationally considered a key Arab leader, heroic warrior, and legendary figure. Why was the meeting secret? First, the war was still ongoing, and there were still German bombs falling on Cairo, near where they intended to meet. The second reason? Roosevelt had pledged to Churchill that the United States would not intervene in territory controlled by the British. Although Saudi Arabia had not been a British colony, the British had other interests in the area. There were two main reasons for the meeting between Roosevelt and Ibn Saud. The first dealt with the prospect of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East, and the second reason was oil, black gold. Probably the best eyewitness record of the historic meeting is a 47-page booklet called FDR Meets Ibn Saud, written by William A. Eddy, a retired U.S. Marine Corps colonel and first U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Thanks to his fluency in Arabic, Eddy served as Roosevelt's translator and liaison to Ibn Saud. The king was transported aboard the USS Murphy from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to the Suez Canal, where he would rendezvous with Roosevelt. According to Eddy, the king arrived with a traveling party that included 42 servants and one astrologer. Although the king did not bring his harem on board, as half of the ship could not be curtained off, which might lead to the accidental exposure of their faces. Ibn Saud also brought his own provisions, including a herd of 100 sheep to be slaughtered on board because he would not eat American frozen food, which was more than 24 hours old, in violation of the Arab custom which demands fresh food. Eddy did manage to negotiate the number of sheep down to a mere 7. The naval quarters were deemed too small to host royalty, so a special tent made of canvas with oriental rugs was set up on the ship's deck. Despite the lack of a common language, Eddy noted that the U.S. and Arab crews fraternized with friendliness. The king tasted American apple pie and pancakes, and the Americans were treated to lamb-only Arab meals. War stories were told, and the king showed a keen interest in the ship's armament, which included a target shooting demonstration with the heavy weaponry. After 2 days of sailing, the USS Murphy finally docked with the USS Quincy, where Roosevelt was waiting. On Valentine's Day, February 14, 1945, Roosevelt and Ibn Saud met aboard the USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake along the Suez Canal. It was the first time a U.S. president had ever met a Saudi Arabian king. The two leaders immediately hit it off, probably not because it was Valentine's Day. The king spoke of being the twin brother of the president. They were both aging leaders who were unable to walk easily, both liked farming, and both were heads of state with grave responsibilities. Ibn Saud was not stricken with polio like Roosevelt, but at age 70, and after having suffered from many war wounds when he was younger, the king could only walk with great pain and difficulty. The president said, "But you are fortunate to have the use of your legs to take you wherever you choose to go." The king replied, "It is you, Mr. President, who are fortunate. My legs grow feebler every year. With your more reliable wheeled chair, you are assured that you will arrive." The president then said, "I have 2 of these chairs, which are also twins. Would you accept one as a personal gift from me?" The king said, "Gratefully, I shall use it daily and always recall affectionately the giver, my great and good friend." Roosevelt then presented the king with a spare duplicate of the wheelchair he was sitting in. It was one of many gifts exchanged that day. Roosevelt also gifted to the king a DC-3 passenger plane, which I assume was not aboard the USS Quincy like the wheelchair was. In exchange, the king gifted to Roosevelt a diamond-encrusted dagger, perfumes, pearl jewelry, belts of woven gold cloth, and embroidered harem costumes, among other gifts. After lunch, Roosevelt and Ibn Saud went back on deck for a 4-hour meeting. Having built a personal rapport and agreeing that the United States and Saudi Arabia should remain allied in the post-war world, Roosevelt raised the issue of a Jewish homeland. 2 weeks earlier, the Soviet Army had just liberated the Auschwitz concentration camp, exposing the full extent of the evils of the Nazi regime to the world. As the leader of the new free world, FDR seemed to have taken the plight of the Jews as a personal mission. Roosevelt tried to persuade the king to accept 10,000 Jews in Palestine. Ibn Saud firmly replied that the Axis countries responsible for the suffering of the Jews should pay reparations and house them. The Jews should return to live in the lands from which they were driven, he said. Roosevelt responded that few Holocaust survivors would want to live in Germany. Unpersuaded, the king said, "Make the enemy and the oppressor pay. That is how we Arabs wage war. Amends should be made by the criminal, not by the innocent bystander. What injury have the Arabs done to the Jews of Europe? It is the Christian Germans who stole their homes and lives. Let the Germans pay." Roosevelt tried another tack. The Arabs were numerous and their lands extensive. The Jews, by contrast, were few. The king looked FDR in the eye and uttered one word: La. No. Despite the personal goodwill, Roosevelt was unable to persuade Ibn Saud to change his mind about a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. He did not want to cooperate in any form of Jewish immigration to the region. Roosevelt complied, promising that the U.S. would make no move hostile to the Arab people. Harry Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt as president, broke this promise in 1947 when he endorsed the United Nations partition plan for Palestine after the war and then recognized the Jewish state there, leading to decades of friction between the Arab states and the U.S. Roosevelt had one more meeting objective. He next steered the conversation to oil. In 1938, two U.S. oil companies, Chevron and Texaco, both offshoots of the fragmented Standard Oil monopoly, partnered together and discovered enormous volumes of oil in eastern Saudi Arabia. Subsequent geologic analyses showed that the entire center of gravity in world oil production and supply would soon shift to the Persian Gulf, to Saudi Arabia in particular. Today, the state-owned Saudi Aramco company that was formed as a result of this partnership is the third most valuable company in the world. The Roosevelt administration and oil industry leaders had deep concerns that a major oil shortage was imminent. At stake was the oil needed to fuel the American war effort and U.S. post-war recovery. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes linked Saudi oil with the national security of the U.S. He even proposed that the federal government establish direct control over all oil reserves owned by American companies in Saudi Arabia. There were also signs that the British were trying to take control over Chevron Texaco and Saudi Arabia's oil, like they already had in Persia, today's Iran, and Kuwait. So part of Roosevelt's goal in meeting the Saudi king was strategic. FDR knew the meeting would serve U.S. national interest in oil security long term. Because of the connection between the king and the president, the king was open to further U.S. exploration of Arab oil fields. These drilling rights and the oil they produced led to a boost in the U.S. economy that lasted for decades. By 1949, the king had authorized a pipeline to the Mediterranean, allowing the flow of Saudi oil to U.S. allies, a U.S. Air Force operated base near the oil fields, and a military training program. Shortly after his audience with Roosevelt, Ibn Saud held a summit with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to discuss similar issues about the future of the Middle East. Ibn Saud and Churchill didn't share the same connection that Ibn Saud had experienced with Roosevelt. The British attempted to outshine the Americans with a larger ship and a grander display, which Ibn Saud apparently found dull and off-putting. He preferred the more engaging and personal atmosphere provided by Roosevelt. Roosevelt also enjoyed his encounter with Ibn Saud and found their conversation to be productive. According to the White House, FDR said, "I learned more about the Near East by talking with Ibn Saud for 5 minutes than I could have learned in an exchange of 2 or 3 dozen letters." Ibn Saud, by all accounts, was extremely touched by FDR's present of his own wheelchair. Whenever the king took really close friends through his palace at Riyadh, he showed them his private apartment, where his wheelchair rested with the White House tag still on it. The king always said, "This chair is my most precious possession. It is the gift of my great and good friend, President Roosevelt, on whom Allah has had mercy." That wheelchair is still in the possession of the Saudi royal family today. Ibn Saud later would use a wheelchair, but not the chair gifted by Roosevelt. According to the U.S. State Department, The chair was too small for the king, who was larger and had more muscle mass than the president. Roosevelt asked that a new, larger version be shipped to the king. This was done in August 1945. On March 1, 1945, FDR addressed Congress for the final time. During the speech, the president reported on the success of the Yalta Conference, his encounters with Middle Eastern leaders, the nearing end of the war in Europe, and his goals for lasting world peace through the United Nations. Roosevelt entered the chamber of the House of Representatives in a wheelchair, which was not usual. The president remained seated for the duration of the speech and apologized to the assembly, explaining it was difficult to walk to the podium with the heavy weight of his leg braces, which allowed him to stand by locking his legs firmly in place. For 12 years, Roosevelt had tried to keep references to his paralysis and disability from the public, and for the most part, the press abided. But now they were curious. Why make public the gift of the wheelchair and the direct reference to his mobility in his March 1st address to Congress? The answer from friends and political associates was that Roosevelt was done running for office. And he was. 8 weeks after meeting Ibn Saud, Roosevelt passed away. Poetically, on the 63rd anniversary of Roosevelt's seated address to Congress from his wheelchair, March 1, 2008, the first International Wheelchair Day was observed to enable wheelchair users to celebrate the positive impact a wheelchair has in their lives. Thanks for watching.